Ambassador Mike McFaul, great to see you again.
Glad to be here.
So let me ask you about Ukraine. Today marks 1,000 days of the Russia-Ukraine war, and Ukraine is heading into its third most challenging winter since the war started, as systematic attacks by Russia have damaged and destroyed most of the country's energy infrastructure. Can you share with us your view on where things stand now, particularly for the people of Ukraine who have been enduring this conflict for almost 3 years now?
Well, it's not good. It's a bad situation. Moods in Ukraine are low. I talked to one friend over the weekend. And he said it's always depressing here, Mike, when the winter comes, but this one is going to be especially difficult because of what you just talked about, the energy infrastructure being so damaged. It's going to be cold and dark winter for those in the cities. And I also got a video actually from a colleague of mine, a military commander from the trenches just a week ago. And he's locked down. He's been there, but he's been there for 3 years. There have been no rotations. And so that's on the micro level. And then the macro story is not a good one either. They're just holding on to territory, trying to slow the offensive inside Ukraine. And they're achieving results, but that's a very difficult fight, particularly in Donbass. And then in Kursk, inside Russia, where Ukrainian soldiers took Russian territory for the first time, I think, since Hitler, by the way, that a country invaded Russia and occupied their territory. They've been there for many, many weeks, but they are now preparing for a major pushback, upwards of 50,000 soldiers between Russians and then 10,000 North Korean soldiers, because Putin wants to take that territory before Mr. Trump becomes president, thinking that once he becomes president, there will be a kind of, everybody stop fighting and you get to keep the territory you have. So Putin wants to gain back that Russian territory before President Trump is inaugurated.
Is that what you expect will happen, Mike? That they will be working out some agreement? And what will that mean for Ukraine?
Well, I don't know. These are difficult decisions. I can tell you that Ukrainians are frustrated that the debate here in the United States is all about what they're supposed to do. It's all about what Zelensky's supposed to do in terms of compromise, and hardly any discussion about what Putin's supposed to do. And just to state the obvious, it's Putin that started this war. It's Putin that invaded Ukraine. Zelensky didn't invade Russia, and yet all the conversation, especially around those close to Trump, is about what Zelensky needs to do. That said, I think I sense a commitment to at least try to engage with the new Trump administration when they come into office in January.
You mean by Zelensky?
Yes, yes.
Well,
Not
they've had a phone call, right? He had a phone call with President-elect Trump and apparently Elon Musk, which was weird, right?
Yes, that's very weird. Um, and I don't think that call from the reporting was done in the normal way that they're done during transitions, where the State Department coordinates it and then provides a translator. And I don't think Mr. Putin speaks English very well, but maybe it was enough. Oh, Zelensky does. Sorry. Back
Yeah.
to Zelensky. Zelensky speaks fluently. I was thinking about the other
Yeah,
alleged
no,
call
I
to
was
Putin.
thinking I was thinking about the initial Zelensky call, and Zelensky said it was a good conversation.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and he has to say that. Whatever they think privately, whatever their blood pressure rises when they hear President-elect Trump praising Vladimir Putin. And remember, Kim Jong-un. They're now fighting two dictators that President Trump claims to have good relations with. But they have no choice. They have to deal with the president who's been elected by the American people. And so they are bracing themselves to think about what a negotiation might look like that, of course, would be in Ukrainians' national interest. What they worry about, their biggest concern, is that, again, not President-elect Trump. I want to emphasize that, but there are people close to him who have said, will cut off aid to Ukraine, and then Zelensky will be forced to do a deal. And the Ukrainians I talk to, and I agree with them, they say that you do that, and then Putin has no incentive to actually negotiate. He'll just keep pushing further because he knows that his enemy is weaker. And so I think there'll have to be some kind of negotiation, or at least attempt at negotiation, but it has to be in a moment of stalemate on the battlefield, not a moment where Putin has all the advantages. And you know, I've known Putin for a while. I dealt with him across the table. You know, I didn't get to choose who was the president of Russia when I was the ambassador. So you have to deal with who is ever on the other side of the table. But one thing I know about him is he wants a subjugated Ukraine, not just what he has today. And one thing I know about wars more generally, they tend to end in two ways. Either one side wins and dictates the terms, or there's a stalemate on the battlefield and they agree to terms. They rarely end when one side has all the momentum and then they get a phone call from Washington or Brussels or Beijing and say, hey, you should quit your war now. That is just not a scenario that I think has a probability of success.
Let's talk about what could and has transpired between now and the inauguration when Donald Trump resumes power. For the first time, the Biden administration has authorized Ukraine to use U.S. supplied ballistic missiles for attacks inside Russia. And the first attack was apparently made pre-dawn today in the Bryansk, am I saying that correctly?
Yes, you are.
Bryansk
Yes.
region of southwestern Russia, according to the New York Times. This is a major policy change, as you know, Mike, and the choice has divided President Biden's advisors. Talk about the thinking behind this authorization and why the Biden administration decided to do it now.
Well, first, I want to applaud the decision. I wish it was done 2 years ago when Ukraine was in a stronger position. But to explain it, the debate has always been about a fear of escalation from Putin. And there are those officials in the Biden administration, and I suspect they're reading secret information that I'm not privy to, that warns them that if we do this, if we do that, if we do this third move, Putin is going to escalate. And most certainly, they have hinted, you know, in the public domain, that if Putin is threatened by this new weapon systems, these ATACMS, that's what they're called, these long-range missiles, that they will respond in kind, that they will escalate. Now, again, I want to be crystal clear. I do not have access to the same information that President Biden and his national security team have. And so I can't evaluate those threats that they're seeing. But this is a movie we've been to before. This is a rodeo we've been to before. We've had this debate for years now. Every weapon system that the Biden administration has provided to Ukraine, before they provided it, there was a debate about escalation. And I want to remind your viewers, we had this debate even about Patriot missile systems, anti-defense, weapon systems against anti-aircraft and missiles. We had it about tanks. We had it about HIMARS, another long-range system, but not as long-range as ATACMS. We had a big debate about F-16s and fighter aircraft. If those are provided, Putin is going to respond. And I would just say so far, every time one of those systems have been delivered, there has not been a major escalatory response. And by that, I mean either the use of a nuclear weapon, that's been the fear in the past, or an attack on a NATO ally. That's also been a fear in the past. So I hope that that will not happen. And I would add to that, I think it's especially unlikely right now because Trump is coming back to the White House. Why rationally would Putin escalate, especially with a nuclear weapon, by the way, that the entire world would condemn? Why would he do that now, right at the moment when he thinks he's going to have a new interlocutor in the White House that is going to be much more sympathetic to his position? So I understand the fear, but I think it's unlikely.
What about the message this was designed to send the North Koreans? Because apparently this decision to allow the Ukrainians to use these long range missiles came in response to Russia's decision to bring North Korean troops into the fight.
Well, I hope it has that deterrent effect. I think this is a major escalation on Putin's part, right? That's the part, by the way, that never gets discussed. He's been escalating all the time. He just used one of his most sophisticated missiles ever against civilians just 5 days ago, and nobody ever calls that escalation. 10,000 North Korean troops is escalation. And I do think the Biden administration wants to send a signal to Kim Jong-un not to expand his military operation in Russia. I think it also gives them a bit of an alibi to finally provide this clearance, this green light to the Ukrainians. Again, I think it should have been done a lot longer, a lot earlier, but I'm glad they're doing it now.
There are a few other things that you're hoping the Biden administration will do before President Biden leaves office. Can you quickly tell us what those are?
Yeah, and I want to remind everybody, he's still the president of the United States. We have a system, one president at a time. There's no reason he should change his policy now. And there are lots of things I think he should get done ahead of time that I think will be good for American national security interests. So number one, get all that military aid that's been pledged and committed by the Congress to Ukraine right now so that it can't be interrupted after January 20th. Number two, many years ago already, shocking to say that, the United States and our allies in Europe rightly froze Russian assets, primarily Central Bank of Russia assets that are parked right now in bank accounts in the United States and Europe. $300+ billion, by the way. Only a small percentage of that is here in the United States, but there's been this debate for years what they should do with it in the future. I think Biden should approve giving that money to Ukraine now. Maybe put it into an international development account so that it just doesn't go all to the central government. But I think if he made that bold decision now, that might encourage our allies, where most of this money is sitting, to do the same. Third, there's a zillion more things that could be done on sanctions. And I'm not going to try to go through them all right now, but one really big thing is that to circumvent sanctions, Putin has been using vessels, ships, this gray fleet they call it, that are unregistered and are dangerous and don't have insurance, by the way. So if they tip over and there's an oil spillage, really disastrous consequences for those states, countries that have borders with those places. Sanction all of those ships right now. Put them out of business. Would have a very consequential impact on the revenues flowing into Russia today. And finally, I think President Biden should declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. Russia is terrorizing civilians in Ukraine every single day. Most experts agree with me. These are acts of terrorism. Putting them on the list would really constrain what they can do with Americans. And I just want to remind your viewers, Cuba is on this list. How can Cuba be on this list, but not Russia today? And I think if President Biden took this courageous step, number one, it would be good for limiting revenues going into Russia. But even if Trump might not want to continue it, it would give President Trump and his negotiating team a chit to negotiate if, in fact, they get to that place. So I think it's a really smart idea. The president has the ability to do it. He should do it before January 20th.
A final note on Ukraine, Mike. You've said Trump fundamentally doesn't care about Ukraine. He fundamentally doesn't care about democracy or the international rules of the game, that annexing parts of other countries is a bad thing. He still fundamentally does care about his personal relationship with Putin. He's been very consistent in his support for Putin, his admiration for Putin. That has never, ever wavered. So going forward, he, in your view, is going to rubber stamp any kind of negotiation that gives Russia more that land than it had when this whole conflict started.
Well, that's most certainly what I fear. And they'll just say, stop fighting and we're pulling out. And, as we were talking before, I actually don't think that ends the war. So he promised to end the war. I don't think that ends the war. But two, it ends it in very unfavorable terms for Putin, for Ukraine, and favorable to Putin. And I hope that when he sits with his new national security teams, he realizes that this is bigger than Ukraine. Xi Jinping's looking at you, President-elect Trump. He's looking. Is he just going to walk away when the going gets rough? And if that's the case, I think that emboldens Xi Jinping to think about plans for taking Taiwan. That's not good for American national security interests. That's not good for the stability of the international system. I think that really has a probability of actually dragging us into a war with China. So they keep using the phrase peace through strength. Be strong in Ukraine, and that will help us to avoid war with China over Taiwan. And there are lots of self-alleged China hawks in the Trump team. They call themselves that, and they're very proud of it. I hope that they understand that rewarding Xi Jinping's closest ally in the world today, Vladimir Putin, does not send a positive, strong signal to Xi Jinping about how you're going to check Chinese power.
Let's take a step back and talk about the overall shift in our foreign policy and US foreign policy once Trump assumes office. How is it going to be different, Mike?
Well, I don't know. That's a big question. I'll tell you how it feels to me. This is a major, major moment in the history of America's place in the world. We had a long period of isolationism for 150 years. Then we got engaged first in World War II. Then we put our head back in the sand because of isolationists who used the phrase, by the way, America first. And we thought that, wars in China, when Japan invaded China, we said, that's not our problem, it's far away. Hitler went into Poland, we said, that's not our problem, it's far away. And then it became our problem on December 7th, 1941. And that indifference in the years leading up to that made that war much more consequential. Then we had a period of consensus. We had debates, of course, over big things like Vietnam, and we had debates over the strategies of containment, but there were debates kind of, between the 45-yard lines, between Democrats and Republicans about how to deal with the threat of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And we basically agreed that we had to do it through engaging in the world, from building and then maintaining multilateral institutions, and then supporting our democratic values. And I want to be clear, there were nuances, there were debates. Actually, the debates during the Cold War were more within the Democratic Party and within the Republican Party than between them, but there was a kind of consensus. Fast forward to today, on the three big debates, we now have a president who's on the extreme end of all three debates. So isolationism versus internationalism, he's an isolationist. Biggest isolationist we've had since the 1930s. Unilateralism versus multilateralism. That is, do we just go it alone and don't care what our allies or the UN thinks? Or do we cooperate with our allies, and do we work with multilateral institutions like the United Nations, like the World Bank? Trump is a unilateralist in the extreme. And then, in my world, this debate is between realists and liberals. I hate both of those words because I don't think it's realistic to not care about democracy. And the word liberals, of course, in the United States immediately invokes a certain kind of progressivism. That's not what I mean, but it's basically, do we care about democracy and liberal values, or just call it freedom? Do we care about freedom or not? Trump doesn't care about that, right? He likes dictators, and in his first term in office, I can't even remember a time that he met with a democracy activist from Belarus or Iran or China or Russia. He's an extremist on that as well. So if you just look at his positions and what he said, this is going to be a pretty fundamental change in American foreign policy. And then add to that a few other things. The first time Trump was elected, I think he was just as surprised as I was that he won that election. He hadn't planned for it. And so he brought into the government, his generals, he called them. Some of them work, I can see Hoover Tower from where I'm sitting. They now work out here, right? And these were kind of traditional. I disagreed with them on certain policy positions, but General Mattis, General McMaster, others, they were not that different from that earlier debate. None of those people are going to be back with him. Number two, he's learned how to use the U.S. government and how the U.S. government works. He didn't really understand that the first time around. That will be different. And number three, he thinks he has a mandate from the American people to execute this revolution in American foreign policy. Now, I don't read the exit polls the same way that he does, and most certainly the way that Elon Musk is reading them. But that's what they think. And therefore, I think it could be a pretty rocky time in American foreign policy.
In practical terms, Mike, what do these changes, these major shifts in foreign policy philosophy mean? Because I think right now it almost feels like a professorial exercise.
Yes.
But what in pragmatic terms does it mean?
Well, if they achieve everything, and I'm not ready to accept that they will. We can come back to that. We're not a monarchy. We still have a Congress. We still have media. We still have civil society. And there are some people within the Trump foreign policy team that think more like me, or at least they used to. We'll see if they will when they're in power, than they think along the lines of President-elect Trump. But if it all happens, I think it's the end of American leadership of the free world. And I think that's really bad for American security, for American prosperity, and for our American ideals. This idea that we can just pull back and pretend that the outside world doesn't matter, it didn't work in the 1930s, and it especially won't work today when we're much more intertwined than the 1930s. Remember, we couldn't be attacked on a cybersecurity attack back in the 1930s. We can now. Today, we have ICBMs that can reach our land in minutes. That wasn't true in the 1930s. So I think it has rather bad consequences, because as we pull out, the Chinese and the Russians are going to be more active in that space. And then I think it becomes a very, very dangerous world. And Katie, when I teach about this, Katie, here at Stanford with my students, because you said professorial, I start with a map of 1,000 years of history in Europe in 6 minutes. And I show my students what happened before 1945. And what that map shows is that, empires come, empires go, borders change, millions and millions of people died. And then we decided, after the end of the most horrible war ever, World War II, we don't want to go back to that Hobbesian anarchic world of just might makes right. And so we created institutions to try to prevent it. And even during the Cold War, that was pretty scary. And by the way, millions died during that war too. It wasn't cold. But we didn't have major wars in Europe. We didn't have annexation. That was a great achievement. And I fear that if America pulls back, we're going to go back to that anarchic world where lots of people are going to die. And eventually, tragically, we will eventually be pulled back into it as well.
What has the response been, Mike, from world leaders to some of the moves President-elect Trump has already made?
Well, they've been planning for this. That's the first thing I would say. Most certainly Ukrainians have. I was in Europe last month in Berlin and Prague at some big multilateral meetings. And I got to tell you, I was shocked. Everybody had already, figured in that Trump was going to win. I think I may have been the only one that thought he wasn't going to, that it wasn't already a fait accompli. So they're bracing in a couple of ways. One, they're all going to try to re-engage with Trump, just like they did the first time around. They're going to roll out their flattery packages. They're going to talk about his indispensable, leadership. They're going to do that. You saw President Zelensky already doing that in his phone call, right? We're two outsiders, he said, right? I'm from television and he's from television. We're anti-status quo people. That's going to be the first strategy. Second, with regard to security, they're going to hedge their bets. There's already conversations in Europe, especially in Northern Europe, the Baltic states, Finland, Sweden, Poland, that they may have to prepare to go it alone. And to protect their citizens, they might not be able to rely on NATO. I think that would be a horrible tragedy, but those conversations are already taking place.
I was going to ask you what's going to happen to NATO, Mike.
Well, I'm not giving up yet. I'm going to keep fighting for NATO. I'm going to try to explain to why it's better to have allies than not. Churchill was right when he said the only thing worse than going to war is going to war alone. Like, why do we want to do that? Why do we want to blow up our relationships with Japan and South Korea at a time when China's rising? I think there's an argument still to be made to keep us there.
But Donald Trump has been so critical and downright hostile to NATO.
But what are we going to do? Just capitulate? I'm going to fight for it. I'm going to try to explain to the American people that NATO's in our interests. By the way, they are spending more on their defense. Mr. Trump needs to update his data. 23 nations are over 2%, and that's good for us. Because if there's no NATO, then I think this is a really important concept. Peace through strength. Just keep it really simple. If we're strong, we deter Russia from attacking countries. If we're strong, we deter China from trying to take Taiwan. If we're weak, or we signal we're not going to come to the aid of our allies in those countries, then there's going to be conflict, and then we get dragged into the conflict. That's what happened in World War II, right? Americans, firsters said, what happens in Poland doesn't matter to us. And then it mattered to us. What happens in Japan invading China? Why do we care about China? It doesn't matter to us. And then it mattered to us when we were attacked. And so rather than pretending that we can just stick our head in the sand and what the Chinese and the Russians and Iranians do abroad won't affect us, I think we're better off engaging, deterring, keeping the peace now so that we don't get dragged into European and Asian and Middle Eastern wars later.
In spite of his claim of isolationist tendencies, though, Donald Trump's rhetoric seems to signal that he is strong and unpredictable. And by virtue of his personality and the fear he engenders, some of these nations won't do some of the things you're talking about, won't invade other countries. He has often said that Putin wouldn't have done this to Ukraine if he had been president. So what do you make of this sort of almost bifurcated foreign policy strategy of isolationism and yet stoking fear in the eyes of some of these aggressive leaders, if that makes sense?
No, it's a great point. And it is a point of tension. It's his unilateralism versus isolationism, right? And his tough guy image. And I don't know. I want to keep saying I don't know because I don't know. We're in an era of uncertainty, and people should humbly and modestly accept that instead of pretending they can predict the future. I would say a couple of things, though. Number one, it is just not true that Trump prevented the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine started in 2014. It was ongoing for the entire Trump presidency. And you don't believe me? I have friends who lost soldiers, Ukrainian warriors, during that period. He didn't stop the war. He didn't do anything to stop the war. So the idea that it didn't happen on his watch is just not true. Number two, I get the point about being the crazy uncle and, better watch out for me. But I would much rather have a stable set of allies, committing to a course of action than to rely on that because, be careful what you wish for. They might be tempted to call your bluff, President-elect Trump. And I just don't think we can afford to just keep it all on the whim of the crazy uncle. And third, I just remind you, because people are reading very closely the tea leaves of what he will and will not do in other countries. To the crazy uncle thing in Europe, he said to our allies on the frontline states, if you don't pay up, I want Putin to do whatever the hell he wants. I'm paraphrasing, but it was something like that. That sounds like crazy in the opposite direction. And when we talk about Taiwan, and that's the place that worries me the most about us getting dragged into a war that we need to deter, not fight. When he says, "Well, they stole all our technology, why should we care about Taiwan?" That sounds like a crazy uncle, but not the crazy uncle that's going to go fight, for the sovereignty or the territorial integrity of Taiwan.
For someone who has had so much experience in government, Mike, I'd love for your take on some of the people that Donald Trump wants to put in these very significant, important positions of power, especially when it comes to foreign policy, defense, and intelligence. Senator Marco Rubio is Secretary of State, Representative Michael Waltz as National Security Advisor, Tulsi Gabbard is Director of National Intelligence, Elise Stefanik as U.S. Ambassador to the UN, and Pete Hegseth as the Secretary of Defense. When you see those names, what are your thoughts?
Well, first, it's a real mixed bag. That list that you just described, they are not all the same in terms of their readiness for the job. Senator Rubio was at my confirmation hearing in 2011, and I'm telling that for two reasons. One, we had a very cordial, back and forth. Actually, my kids were there, right? They were young and they watched the whole thing. It was kind of boring. And at the end, I asked them who did they like and who they didn't like, and they didn't know who were Democrats and Republicans. And they liked Marco Rubio the best, Republican. The person they didn't like, I'm just reporting what my kids said, was Senator Menendez, the Democrat, because they thought he was too mean.
Well, they don't have to worry about him anymore.
Well, that's true. We don't have to. And my friend Andy Kim is about to replace him. That, by the way, is a major upgrade. That is fantastic for the American people and security. We'll come back to that if we have time. But I tell you that story for two reasons. One, we weren't yelling and screaming at each other, and this kind of interaction that sometimes happens now between the MAGA folks and other people. It was a very cordial, substantive, even if we disagreed. But two, it took place in 2011. He's been at this for a long time. He is, I think, well prepared to be Secretary of State. What I don't know is, will he just capitulate to everything that President Trump says? I mean, when the rubber hits the road is when you're in the White House Situation Room. You're at a National Security Council meeting. The president chairs that. The Secretary of State sits right next to him, or one person down on the right. Will Secretary Rubio give him advice based on what he believes, or will he just roll over to just do whatever the president says? That is not your job, in my opinion. Your job is to give him advice. That is the place to do it, and I don't know. Congressman Michael Waltz, I don't know him personally, but we have mutual friends. That seems like a very strong choice to me. Obviously, he understands war and peace. He said some very positive things when it comes to Russia and China. From my point of view, that seems like a really great appointment. We could go through them all. The ones that worry me the most actually is the nominee for Secretary of Defense. I'm going to try to be diplomatic here. I don't know him. I've watched him on TV, by the way. I watch Fox News. Maybe a lot of people don't. I try to. I don't see a consistent view of American national security in anything he said. He's a flamethrower. He's trying to get the attention of Mr. Trump, and he's done that.
He seems grossly inexperienced. I know he was in the military. He went to Princeton and the Kennedy School at Harvard, but he's never really run a massive organization. How many employees does the Pentagon have, Mike? Is it 3.2 million or something?
It's over 3 million if you count all our soldiers. Yeah. Well, that is true. But I'll tell you honestly, I'm less worried about that because the Pentagon can run itself if need be. There's a lot of super competent people there, as long as they don't, dismiss them all as they're threatening to do. But I worry about him at that National Security Council meeting that I just described, right? Because he's at the left. They're right in the front, and everything he said makes me nervous about the kind of advice he's going to give to the president. And I'm not worried about the day to day. I'm worried about the moment of crisis, right? I'm worried about their September 11th. I'm worried about their September 24th, 2022. That's the day that Putin invaded Ukraine. We call these in academia exogenous shocks, things that you can't predict that are going to happen on, maybe they'll get lucky, but oftentimes they often happen that you don't predict. And that's where I'm not sure that his judgment about American national security is wisdom.
What about Tulsi Gabbard? We got so many questions about her and the fact that she met with Assad and Putin, and the New York Times writes her selection has raised alarms among national security officials, not only because her lack of experience in intelligence, but also because she has embraced a worldview that mirrors disinformation straight out of the Kremlin's playbook.
Well, that's very scary to me.
Do you agree with that?
Well, I agree with that, but I also want to tell you about the job. I know that job. I just hosted the current person in that job right now here at Stanford just last week, Avril Haines. There's a good news, bad news thing here. The bad news is that she believes these conspiracy theories. She hangs out with these dictators. She seems more sympathetic to Putin than she does to American national interests. That's very bad. And there are allegations of even, closer relationships with these places, these countries. I can't comment on that. I don't know that, but they're definitely swirling in my world. That's the bad news. The good news is this is not a policy-making job. This is a job to aggregate intelligence over 18 different agencies and to manage it. And again, I hate to sound cynical about it, but that is a massive, or all those groups are massive organizations. The CIA has always been the 800-pound gorilla, and the idea that the head of the DNI can immediately begin to politicize intelligence, not so easy to do. There's a sophisticated people in those organizations that will use extraordinary means to make sure that doesn't happen.
Not to be a downer, Mike, but what if they get rid of all those sophisticated people in those agencies? It seems to me that they're trying to do a wholesale removal. If you listen to Project 2025, they want to quote unquote drain the swamp. And that means getting rid of a lot of these career government experts.
Correct. Well, both at the Pentagon and in the intelligence community, and I'm not an expert, but I would say at Justice too. If they do that, then we're in real trouble. Then we need a state. We are a big, important country in the world, and we need a state, a state with capacity. We need government. Maybe we don't need excess bureaucracy. That's fine. I agree with that. But we need a capable state. And if these folks go in and succeed at destroying the state, then we're in big trouble.
Before we go, I want to ask you about Elon Musk's very prominent role in this transition. As you know, he's been with Donald Trump side by side at Mar-a-Lago, head of reducing or improving government efficiency. Tell us any concerns you have about Elon Musk having such a role.
Well, I'd say two things, one positive and then one negative. So the positive is the idea that we should try to reduce government inefficiencies. Who disagrees with that? I'm all for that. And you and I, we're old enough to remember that's what Al Gore did. It was called reinventing government. That's what he tried to do. That maybe the two of them should get together and talk about lessons learned. That's fine. That's the good news, that aspiration. The bad news is I don't like the richest person in the planet with nobody elected Elon Musk having this kind of direct influence to do things based on his personal preferences. And maybe even his personal economic interests. I'm going to leave that aside. I don't know that.
But I was
But
going to say there seemed to be the appearance of so many conflicts of interest where he could become even wealthier because of his proximity to the president
yes, well, I
and to
worry about it.
Putin, by the way, and to Putin.
Well, I worry about it. And honestly, it reminds me the Putin era. We can get another day. We'll get back to the parallels there. Tragically, I think we'll be talking about those parallels for a long time to come. But this actually reminds me of the Yeltsin era in Russia, when he was reelected a second time. He was not in good health. He didn't have a lot of capacity to rule, and that's when the richest people in Russia basically privatized the state. And they did things that were not in the long-term interests of Russia. I think that's when the deterioration of Russian democracy happened, and those are the echoes I see. But I want to end on a good note. Obviously, this was an outcome that I didn't vote for, and I'm nervous. And the last 4 years of Trump were difficult for the country and difficult for me personally. Just to remind people, at one point in 2018, he wanted to hand me over to Vladimir Putin, right? So I'm nervous about this administration and this president. But I'm also cautiously optimistic that we have institutions in place to fight the extremes. And the biggest one is this. I've looked at the exit polls. I don't see any data there to support the hypothesis that that the American people want a revolution to tear down the state. That's what revolutionaries do. They tear down the state, and they oftentimes get in wars with other countries, by the way, right? That's what they oftentimes do in leading their revolutions. Think of the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. Americans don't want a revolution. They just want their eggs to be cheaper. And I think if they try to do these revolutionary things that they're promising, and Elon Musk said exactly that, this is a revolution, I think the American people and the institutions that represent them are not going to sign up for it. And I know I myself am not going to sign up for it. I'm going to fight until I am arrested. I shouldn't have joked. I'm not going to be arrested. And if I'm threatened with it, I'm going to fight for it. And I still believe we have rule of law in this country. I'm up to the challenge. And therefore, I have to remain cautiously optimistic, because otherwise you just sit on your hands and let them do all these horrible things. I'm not signing up for that.
In fact, one of my followers said, what can we do as everyday citizens to help combat fascism? I think people are watching everything that's transpiring, and they don't really know what to do, from Matt Gaetz to using the military for mass deportation, all these things that just seem anathema to our values. What can the everyday person do?
Well, again, hard question, especially at this moment. But the first thing to do is to stay informed, to understand, when there are violations of our Constitution versus policy debates. I think that would be a really good lesson for everybody. Don't conflate those things. Let's have a policy debate about what the taxes level should be, right? That's a policy debate. But we shouldn't have a debate about the Constitution and violating that. And I think if we disaggregate that, that's good. There's too much conflation in my world happening on that. That's the first thing. And then second, when those violations do happen, get engaged. And engagement matters. It mattered in the first Trump era. I think people forget it mattered a lot. That first massive women's demonstration right after even before he was elected or right after he was elected, that mobilized people. It mattered, that mobilization, that it was only for 2 years that they control everything. And, I guess, I would just say, I just hosted for dinner 10 days ago a Russian friend of mine, Volodya Karamurza, who just was released from prison, who thought he was going to die in prison. And then he was released in this incredible swap, right? And when you're sitting talking to him, who was arrested and thought after Navalny was killed that he was going to die in jail just because he wanted the right to vote and wanted the right to stand with the placard to say this war is wrong. Who are we to complain that we have those rights? We have to use them. This is not Putin's Russia. This is not Xi Jinping's dictatorship. And so we have to use the rights we have before they get taken away. And I think we have a lot that we still can do before we get to those more dire scenarios.
Ambassador Mike McFaul, always great to talk to you. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thanks for
Appreciate
having
it.
me.